Markets and economies. Markets are a method for allocating scarce resources. Markets are a way of allocating scarce resources. They don't have to be a place or involve the exchange of physical objects. Each buyer or seller in a market chooses to exchange something they have for something they'd prefer to have instead. For example, someone's labour, their work, is a resource. If they have a job, they exchange their labour for a salary. Since everyone is considered to be rational in a free market, an economist would assume that the worker would prefer to have wages but less free time. The employer would prefer to have less money and to know that there's someone there to do some work. Exchanging things in this way results in a particular allocation of resources. Mixed economies combine free markets and government intervention. A free market allocates resources based on supply and demand and the price mechanism. In other words, anything can be sold at any price that people will pay for it. Free market economies have a number of advantages, but there are also some downsides. Pros of a free market: efficiency. As any product can be bought and sold, only those of the best value will be in demand, so firms have an incentive to try to make goods in an efficient way as possible. Entrepreneurship. In a market economy, the reward for good ideas, for example, new, better products or better ways to make existing products, can make entrepreneurs a lot of money. This encourages risk-taking and innovation. Choice. The incentives of innovation can lead to an increase in choice for consumers, and in a free market, consumers aren't restricted to buying only what the government recommends. Cons of a free market. Inequalities. Market economies can lead to huge differences in income. This can be particularly controversial, since many people think particularly large differences are unfair. And in a completely free market, anyone who is unable to work, even if it's not their fault, would receive no income. Non-profitable goods may not be made. For example, drugs to treat rare medical conditions may never sell enough for a firm to make any profit, so these would not be made. Monopolies. Successful businesses can become the only supplier of a product. This market dominance can be abused by charging high prices and restricting output at the expense of the consumer. In a command or planned economy, it's the government, not markets, that decides how resources should be allocated. Communist countries, for example the former USSR, have command economies, but they're much rarer since the collapse of communism in the late 20th century. However, some countries still have command economies, such as North Korea. Pros of a command economy. Market welfare. Governments have more control over the economy, so they can prevent inequality and redistribute income fairly. They can also ensure the production of goods that people need and are beneficial to society. Low unemployment. The government can try to provide everyone with a job and salary. Prevent monopolies. The market dominance of monopolies can be prevented by the government. Cons of a command economy. Poor decision making. A lack of information means the government may make poor and slow decisions about what needs to be produced. Restricted choice. Consumers have a limited choice in what they can consume, and firms will make what they're told to make. Lack of risk-taking and efficiency. Government-owned firms have no incentive to increase efficiency, take risks or innovate because they don't need to make a profit. Market failure occurs when free markets result in undesirable outcomes. For example, traffic congestion is seen as a market failure. Governments often intervene when there's a market failure. They might change the law or offer tax breaks, for example, reduce taxes for anyone carrying out particular activities, or create some kind of incentive to try to influence people's behaviour. Governments can also intervene in the economy by buying or providing goods or services. when both the government and market play a part in allocating resources. This is called a mixed economy, and it's worth noting that down now. A mixed economy has a public sector and a private sector, as I've just said. In a mixed economy, the government is known as the public sector. Businesses that are privately owned make up the private sector. Private sector organisations usually have to break even or make a profit to survive. Most countries have a mixed economy, including the UK. There are no purely free market economies where the government doesn't intervene in some way. In a pure free market economy, there would be no public sector, and in a pure command economy, there would be no private sector. We should also point out there is also a third sector, known as the voluntary sector. This sector includes charities and non-profit making organisations. Smith, Marx and Hayek were influential economic thinkers. So we're going to look at three of these now. Adam Smith. Smith's ideas have shaped traditional economic theory. He was a big believer in the free market and described how its invisible hand would allocate resources in society's best interests. He said that this came about because consumers and producers are motivated by self-interest. Consumers are motivated to maximise their own benefits, and producers are motivated to maximise profits. In the free market, consumers' demand and producers' supply will lead to price levels being set at a point which benefits them both, i.e. the price mechanism. Smith pointed out that in order for the free market to work properly, there couldn't be any monopolies, and there would have to be low barriers to entry to maximise profits. This little point about the barriers, or about the low barriers to entry to maximise competition is discussed in our second year on the course. Smith also wrote about specialisation and the division of labour. We will be returning to this on the AS programme. Karl Marx. Marx was critical of the free market and argued that it created a situation where a small ruling class of producers, the bourgeoisie, dominated and exploited the larger working class of wage earners, the proletariat. Marx argued that profit-maximising bourgeois producers would exploit workers, for example, paying them low wages and giving them few rights, until the proletariat eventually rose up in revolution and took over. This would then lead to the workers controlling production and everyone having a share in the ownership of resources. Marx's idea led to the rise of communism in the 20th century, but his ideas contain little about how command economies would work. Many communist countries collapsed in the late 20th century, which led to the discrediting of communism and command economies. But Marx's ideas are becoming more popular now. Friedrich Hayek. Hayek was a keen supporter of the free market system and a critic of command economies. He argued that government should intervene to allocate resources because governments lack the information required to allocate them in the way that's most beneficial to society. Hayek believed that individual consumers and producers have the best knowledge of what they want or need, and so the allocation of resources should be left to them and the price mechanism. Hayek saw the price mechanism as a way for producers and consumers to communicate. The idea of a signalling device between consumers and producers. The price levels set by the force of supply and demand would show both the consumers and the producers what was wanted, and will naturally allocate resources in a much more efficient way than governments can.